There's a recording of me from 11 days before the fleet arrived. It's a staff meeting at NORAD, nothing classified, just a routine quarterly review, and at one point, someone asks me to summarize our current deep space monitoring posture. I'm on camera for about 90 seconds. I look bored, relaxed. I make a joke about how the most exciting thing our orbital telescopes had flagged that quarter was a rogue comet that turned out to be a mislabeled data artifact from a software patch. Everyone laughs. I laugh. I look like a man who has completely accepted that his career will be defined by watching empty space and writing reports about how empty it continues to be. I was the deputy director of the United States Space Surveillance Network, and my biggest professional fear at the time was budget cuts. That recording is 11 days before the sky fills with ships. 11 days before I become one of the most important people on the planet. Not because I was brilliant or brave, but because I was standing in the right room when everything fell apart, and nobody more senior wanted to be the one to say what I was willing to say. The fleet didn't announce itself. There was no gradual approach, no growing dot on a telescope feed, no weeks of mounting tension while scientists argued about what they were seeing. At 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday morning, our orbital surveillance network registered a gravitational anomaly in the space between Earth and the Moon. By 3:48, the anomaly had resolved into discrete signatures. By 3:49, we had a count: 1,114 objects, each massing somewhere between 800 million and 2 billion metric tons, arranged in a spherical formation around the planet at a distance of roughly 400,000 kilometers. They had not traveled to that position. Our instruments showed no approach vector, no deceleration profile, no transit wake. One moment the space was empty. The next, it wasn't. They were simply there, as if the universe had blinked and forgotten they hadn't always been. I was asleep when my phone rang. Colonel Diane Vasquez, my night watch commander, said 4 words that I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "Sir, we have contact." Her voice wasn't panicked. It was flat, controlled in the way that people's voices get when they are processing something too large for their nervous system to metabolize. So they just shut the emotional channel down entirely and operate on pure training. I was dressed and in my car in 3 minutes. I was at Cheyenne Mountain in 14. By the time I walked into the operations center, the room was already full, and every screen on the wall was showing the same thing. A map of Earth surrounded by a perfect geometric shell of objects that our sensors couldn't identify, couldn't classify, and couldn't penetrate with any scanning method we had. The next 6 hours were the most chaotic of my career. The president was woken and briefed. The Joint Chiefs convened. NATO activated its highest alert posture. Russia and China, through emergency diplomatic channels, confirmed they were seeing the same thing and had not caused it. The UN Security Council held an emergency session by video link. And throughout all of it, the fleet did absolutely nothing. They sat there. They didn't transmit. They didn't move. They didn't scan us. At least not in any way we could detect at first. They just occupied the space around our planet with the calm, patient geometry of a siege that didn't need to rush. I want to be honest about the fear. I know the official accounts describe those first hours as measured and professional, and they were, in the sense that people followed their training and did their jobs. But underneath that professionalism was a terror so deep it didn't even feel like fear. It felt like vertigo, like the floor had disappeared and you were still standing, but you knew, logically, that you shouldn't be. I watched a 3-star general excuse himself to the bathroom and come back with wet eyes. And I watched a civilian analyst stare at her screen for 20 minutes without typing anything. I watched a room full of the most capable people in the United States military intelligence apparatus reach the same silent conclusion within the first 2 hours, which was that nothing in our entire civilization's arsenal of knowledge, weapons, or strategies was remotely relevant to what was happening. We were not players. We were audience. The first real data break came on hour 9. Dr. Elena Marchetti, a signals intelligence specialist on loan from the European Space Agency, detected what she called passive emanation from the fleet. Not a transmission, not a scan, a bleed. Like waste heat, but in the electromagnetic spectrum. The ships were running something internally. Some process so energy intensive that it was leaking signal into space despite what appeared to be heavy shielding. Elena spent the next 30 hours mapping those emanations, and what she found was the first real clue about what we were dealing with. The ships were communicating with each other, constantly. in a modulation pattern so dense and so layered that it made our most advanced encryption look like a children's substitution cipher. But the sheer volume of it told us something critical. These weren't automated drones. There wasn't a single AI running the formation. The fleet was crude. Thousands of ships, each one buzzing with internal activity, each one exchanging data with its neighbors at speeds that suggested whatever lived inside them thought faster than we did. And they were arguing. Elena was the first to catch it. Amid the incomprehensible density of their signal traffic, there were structural disruptions, patterns of interruption, overlap, and counter-signal that didn't match coordinated communication. They matched conflict. I reported this to the joint task force that had been assembled under the authority of the UN Security Council, a body of military and scientific leaders from every major nation that had been given nominal authority to coordinate humanity's response. I told them the fleet appeared to be internally divided. I told them whatever decision they were making about us hadn't been made yet. And I told them that this might be our only window to influence the outcome. The response was what you'd expect from a committee of people who had never imagined they'd be in this situation. They argued. As the Americans wanted to transmit a show of strength, the Russians wanted to transmit nothing and focus on underground survival preparations. The Chinese delegation proposed a mathematical greeting designed by their Academy of Sciences. The British wanted to broadcast a curated package of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. The French thought we should send a formal diplomatic communiqué. And through all of it, the real question, the one nobody wanted to ask out loud, hung over the room like a blade. What do you say to something that could erase you when you don't know what it wants, and you don't even know if it's already decided? On day 3, we got our answer about what they wanted. Not from the fleet, from our own instruments. Elena's team had refined their analysis of the passive emanations enough to identify what the fleet's internal processes were actually doing. The ships were scanning us, not with beams or pulses, with something far more sophisticated. They were reading the planet's electromagnetic history. Every radio wave, every television broadcast, every satellite communication, every cell phone signal that had ever leaked into space from Earth's surface was being cataloged, indexed, and analyzed. They were reading us like a library. Every signal we had ever produced, going back to the first spark of radio in the early 20th century, was being pulled apart and reassembled into a portrait of who we were. And the implications of that hit me like a truck. Because if they were reading our history through our transmissions, they weren't just learning what we had built. They were learning what we had said, what we had promised, what we had done to each other. Every war broadcast, every propaganda transmission, every lie beamed into space, and every act of beauty too. Every concert, every emergency broadcast where strangers helped strangers, every message of peace we had ever meant or pretended to mean. They were getting all of it, unfiltered, and whatever judgment they were forming was based on everything, not the version of ourselves we would have chosen to present. Day 4 brought the first attempted communication. Not from us, from the fleet. A single, focused transmission aimed at the geographic center of every continent simultaneously. Identical signal, 7 targets, perfect synchronization. The content was not language as we understood it. It was a mathematical structure, a set of relational equations that our analysts spent 19 hours decoding, and when they finally cracked it, the result was not a greeting or a threat. It was a question. Translated into the closest human equivalent, it asked something like, "By what authority do you consume?" That question nearly broke the task force, not because it was hostile, because nobody understood it. Consume what? Resources? Energy? Land? Life? The ambiguity was paralyzing. Was it an accusation? A philosophical inquiry? A legal proceeding? We didn't know, and the analysts who worked on it couldn't agree. Some read it as ecological, a question about our impact on the planet's biosphere. Others read it as existential, a challenge to our right to exist and expand. A few, including Elena, read it as procedural, as if they were asking us to produce documentation, a permit, a license, as if consuming, whatever that meant in their framework, was something that required authorization from a higher power, and they wanted to see our paperwork. I sided with Elena, and I'll tell you why. Because the way the question was structured, mathematically, used a relational framework that implied hierarchy. Not just any hierarchy. A specific chain of authority, like a customs agent asking a traveler to produce their visa. The question wasn't hostile, it was bureaucratic, and that scared me more than hostility would have because it implied a system, a government, a legal order, something much, much bigger than the 1,100 ships in our sky. The task force debated for 2 days about how to respond. Meanwhile, the fleet waited, patient, still. While the internal signal traffic continued, still fractured, still argumentative, but the scanning had stopped. They had asked their question. They were waiting for our answer. And every hour we didn't provide one, I could feel the window narrowing. On day 6, I did something that would either end my career or define it. I went to the task force with a proposal that made half the room furious and the other half terrified. I proposed that we answer honestly, not with a curated cultural package, not with a show of strength, not with mathematical pleasantries. I proposed that we transmit a complete, unedited archive of human history. Everything. Wars and treaties, genocides and liberations, pollution records and conservation efforts, scientific breakthroughs and their costs, nuclear weapons and the choice not to use them after Nagasaki, the slave trade and its abolition, the destruction of ecosystems and the desperate, inadequate efforts to repair them, everything we were proud of and everything we were ashamed of, without commentary, without framing, without spin. Let them see us as we were. Let them make their judgment on the truth. The American delegation called it suicidal. The Russian representative said I was naive. The Chinese delegation said nothing, which I later learned was because they were privately in favor, but couldn't say so publicly. The British representative, a woman named Admiral Catherine Hale, was the one who tipped the balance. She stood up and said something I'll carry with me forever. She said, "They've already read our transmissions. They already know what we are. The only question is whether we're honest enough to admit it. And if we're not, well, then their question has already been answered." The vote was 11-4. We transmitted the archive on day 7, and then we waited. The fleet received the transmission and went silent. Not the argumentative, fractured silence of internal conflict, true silence. Every signal stream ceased. Every ship went dark. For 14 hours, the fleet hung around our planet like a ring of dead moons, and nobody on Earth knew if we had just saved ourselves or signed our death warrant. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the operations center with Elena and Colonel Vasquez and a handful of analysts, watching screens that showed nothing, listening to frequencies that carried nothing, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that 8 billion people were alive or dead based on a decision I had championed. Elena put her hand on my shoulder at one point. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew we were past the point of words. Hour 15. The fleet reactivated, but the signal traffic that came back was different. The argumentative fractures were gone. In their place was a single unified communication pattern, every ship synchronized, every signal stream aligned. They had reached consensus. After days of internal conflict, something about our transmission, our raw, unfiltered, unflattering truth, had broken the deadlock. And then, on hour 16, they sent a second transmission to Earth. Same structure as the first, same 7 continental targets, same mathematical framework. Our analysts decoded it in 4 hours because they had the key from the first one. And when the translation came through, I felt my knees go weak. Now, it wasn't a verdict. It was a second question. And this time, the question was, do you wish to know what was hidden from us about you? The implication hit me immediately, and from the look on Elena's face, it hit her too. Something had been hidden. Not from us, from them. Someone, within their own chain of command, within their own civilization, had concealed information about humanity from the fleet that had been sent to judge us. The alien armada surrounding our planet was operating on incomplete data, and they had just realized it. I looked at Elena. She looked at me. Colonel Vasquez looked at both of us and said very quietly, "What the hell is happening up there?" That is the question that consumed every waking moment of the next 72 hours. Because the fleet didn't wait for our answer to the second question. What they had asked it as a courtesy maybe, or as a formality, but the consensus they had reached was already in motion. The unified signal pattern shifted into something new, something our analysts had never seen before. A signal structure that was aimed not at each other and not at us, but outward, into deep space. The fleet was calling someone. Elena tracked the signal. It was a focused burst, aimed at a point in the constellation Lyra, traveling at the speed of light toward a star system our catalogs designated as Kepler 442, 112 light-years away. The fleet was sending a message to its homeworld, or to whatever authority existed there. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The signal wasn't a request. Elena and the linguistic team spent 2 days on it and concluded, with high confidence, that the signal was a summons. The fleet was not asking permission. It was demanding that someone answer for what had been done. The tone, the structure, the mathematical framework, all of it pointed to a formal accusation being leveled from the fleet back toward its point of origin. The admirals of the alien fleet were accusing their own government of something, and the accusation was about us. Day 10. The fleet sent its third and final transmission to Earth. This one was longer. Much longer. It took our full team 6 days to decode, and even then, we only had about 60% of the content mapped to comprehensible concepts. But that 60% was enough. It was enough to change everything I thought I understood about what was happening. The transmission was a disclosure, an admission. The fleet's commanding officers, all 14 flag-rank admirals who oversaw the Armada, were telling us what they had discovered when they went silent for those 14 hours. They had cross-referenced our unedited archive, our honest, ugly, beautiful, contradictory record of human civilization, against the intelligence briefing they had been given before departing their homeworld. The briefing that had been used to justify the fleet's deployment to Earth. And the two did not match. Not in small ways. In fundamental, structural, irreconcilable ways. The intelligence briefing had described humanity as a predatory monoculture. A species that consumed resources without limit, expanded without restraint, and posed an existential contamination risk to every system within its eventual reach. It described our electromagnetic emissions as evidence of ecological parasitism. It characterized our internal conflicts as proof of ungovernable aggression. It painted us as a contagion. But our archive told a different story. Not a better story, not a flattering story, but a more complicated one. A species that committed atrocities and then built courts to try the perpetrators. A species that poisoned its own rivers and then spent decades trying to clean them. A species that invented nuclear weapons and then, having used them twice, chose not to use them again for 80 years and counting, despite having thousands. A species capable of genocide and also capable of crossing an ocean to stop one. The archive didn't make us look good. It made us look real. And the reality did not match the threat assessment. The admirals had been lied to. The intelligence briefing they had operated under, of the document that had justified deploying 1,100 warships to a planet that couldn't fight back, was a fabrication. And they knew it now. Because we had given them the one thing nobody expected, the truth about ourselves, delivered without defense, without excuse, and without any attempt to look better than we were. And that truth had contradicted the lie they had been told. The fleet went silent again after the third transmission. But this silence was different. It wasn't deliberation. It was something I recognized from years of military service. The silence that falls over an organization when it realizes it has been betrayed by its own leadership. The silence of loyalty breaking. On day 12, Elena came to me with shaking hands and told me something that redrew the map of everything. As she had intercepted a narrow-beam communication between the fleet's flagship and the second-largest vessel in the formation. It was short. It was encrypted, but with a protocol her team had already partially cracked. And when she decoded it, she found something that no one on Earth was prepared for. It was a resignation letter. The fleet's supreme commander, the highest-ranking admiral in the Armada, was stepping down, effective immediately. And the reason cited in the communication was a single phrase that our linguists translated with high confidence. It meant roughly, "I am unworthy to command. Not defeated, not overruled, not removed, unworthy." A personal judgment, delivered with a formality that Elena said carried enormous cultural weight. In their society, declaring yourself unworthy wasn't just resignation. While it was a permanent renunciation. You were saying that your judgment had been so compromised, so corrupted by false information or personal failure, that you could never be trusted with authority again. It was a kind of death, not physical, but total. I stood there reading Elena's translation, and I felt something I didn't expect. Not relief, not triumph, sadness. Because I recognized what was happening. I had seen it before. In my own species' history, in 100 different contexts. A military officer realizing that the war they were fighting was built on a lie and being unable to continue. The weight of that moment, the private devastation of it, transcended species. I didn't know what these beings looked like. I didn't know how they thought or loved or grieved. Well, but I knew what it felt like to discover that the mission you had dedicated yourself to was rotten at its foundation. I knew that feeling because it's a human feeling too. Within 48 hours, 13 more admirals followed. Every single flag rank officer in the fleet formally declared themselves unworthy of command. 14 resignations, 14 individual acts of something I can only describe as conscience. They could have suppressed what they found. They could have continued the mission on the original intelligence and dealt with the discrepancy later. They could have decided that the lie didn't matter because the fleet was already here, and the easiest path was to follow through. But they didn't. One by one, they chose to stop. And on day 14, the fleet began to move. The fleet began to move on day 14, and I have to be very precise about what that looked like, because the way it's been described in most accounts is wrong. People say the fleet withdrew. They say it departed. They use words that suggest a clean, decisive exit, like a navy pulling out of port. That isn't what happened. What happened was something far stranger and, in its own way, far more unsettling. The ships didn't leave. They rearranged. The spherical formation that had surrounded Earth for 2 weeks began to deform. Ships peeled away from the shell in groups, not toward open space, but toward each other, clustering into dense subformations that orbited the planet in slow, deliberate patterns. It looked, from our tracking stations, like a fist unclenching but not letting go. The fleet was releasing its grip on us without releasing its presence. And the reason, as we would learn over the following days, was that the admirals had resigned, but the fleet had not disbanded. 14 commanders had declared themselves unworthy, but 1,100 ships still hung in our sky, fully crewed, fully armed, and now leaderless. That was the moment I stopped feeling relief and started feeling a new kind of dread. Because a fleet without admirals isn't a fleet at peace. It's a fleet in crisis. And a crisis inside a civilization with the power to sterilize our planet was not something I wanted unfolding 400,000 kilometers above my head. The signal traffic confirmed my fear. With the admirals gone, the unified consensus had fractured again, but this time it was worse. The argumentative patterns Elena's team had been tracking weren't just present, they were escalating. The fleet was splitting, not into 2 factions, but into many. Ship clusters were communicating intensively within their groups and barely at all with other groups. It was tribalization, the kind of breakdown that happens when a military force loses its command structure and every unit starts making its own decisions based on its own interpretation of events. I convened an emergency session with the task force and laid it out as plainly as I could. The admiral's resignations had not ended the crisis. They had transformed it. We were no longer dealing with an organized military operation that might choose to destroy us. We were dealing with a splintered armada that might destroy us by accident, through miscommunication, panic, or factional escalation. And we had no way to talk to them because the only communication protocol they had used with us was the Admiral's formal channel, and the Admirals were gone. The room went very quiet. Admiral Hale, the British officer who had supported my proposal to transmit our archive, was the first to speak. She asked, "Can we identify which faction, if any, is sympathetic to us?" It was the right question, and Elena had a partial answer. Based on signal analysis, she had identified 3 major groupings within the fleet. The largest, comprising about 400 ships, appeared to be maintaining the original formation posture, holding position, making no aggressive moves. She called them the steady group. The second largest, about 300 ships, had begun repositioning into what looked like a departure trajectory, aimed toward the outer solar system. She called them the levers. And the third group, smaller but more active, roughly 200 ships, was doing something that made everyone in the room tense. They were scanning Earth again, not the passive emanation reading of before. Active, focused, deep penetration scans of specific locations. Military installations, power grids, communication hubs. They were mapping our infrastructure with a precision that had only one plausible purpose. Elena called them the hardliners. 200 ships, each one the size of a city. Each one running scans that our most optimistic analysts agreed were target acquisition profiles. And we had no admirals to call off the operation, no unified command structure to appeal to, and no weapons that could do more than irritate them. If the hardliners decided to act, our species had about as much chance as an anthill in the path of a bulldozer. The task force erupted. The American delegation demanded immediate underground evacuation of government leadership. The Russians proposed broadcasting a surrender to the fleet. The Chinese delegation wanted to try direct contact with the steady group, bypassing the hardliners entirely. And Admiral Hale sat there with an expression I had come to recognize as her thinking face. A look of absolute stillness that meant she was working through something the rest of us hadn't seen yet. She raised her hand. The room fell silent. She said, "The admirals resigned because they discovered the intelligence briefing was fabricated. They transmitted a disclosure to us and a summons to their homeworld, but we haven't heard from the homeworld. A message traveling at light speed to a system 112 light-years away won't arrive for 112 years. The fleet's summons is a gesture, not a functional action, which means whoever fabricated that briefing is still in power, still unchallenged, and still has the authority to send new orders." The weight of that landed on me like a physical blow. She was right. The admirals had called for accountability, but their call was traveling at the speed of light across a gulf so vast that everyone who had sent it would probably be dead before it arrived. The lies that had launched this fleet were still intact at the source, and if the homeworld sent new orders on a channel the fleet was still listening to, those orders would carry the authority of the government that had dispatched them. An authority the hardliners might choose to obey. We had days, maybe hours, maybe less. The hardliners weren't acting on current orders, they were acting on old ones. The original mission parameters, the ones built on the fabricated briefing. And without admirals to countermand those parameters, the hardliners could argue, correctly, that the mission was still active. The resignations were personal. The mission was institutional, and institutions don't stop because individuals have crises of conscience. I need to tell you about Commander Lin Xiaoming now, because what happened next doesn't make sense without him. Lin was a Chinese signals intelligence officer who had been assigned to the task force as a liaison, a quiet man in his 50s who rarely spoke in the full sessions but who I had noticed, over the preceding 2 weeks, was always the person most carefully studying Elena's signal analysis. He found me in the corridor after the session broke up and said in perfect English, "You're thinking about this wrong." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Everyone in that room is thinking about how to communicate with the fleet, how to identify the friendly faction, how to negotiate. But the fleet's problem isn't communication. Their problem is legitimacy. The admirals resigned because the mission was built on a lie. The hardliners are still operating because the mission's institutional authority hasn't been revoked. You can't solve an authority crisis with a signal. You solve it with evidence." I stared at him. He continued, "The fleet sent a summons to their homeworld. It will take 112 years to arrive. But they also sent us a disclosure. A partial record of what they found when they compared our archive to their intelligence briefing. What if we can extract from that disclosure the specific structure of the lie? Not just that it was false, but how it was constructed, who authorized it, what data was suppressed, what conclusions were fabricated. If we can reverse engineer the anatomy of the deception from their own internal documents and broadcast it to the entire fleet, not as a human transmission, but as a reconstruction of their own evidence, we don't have to convince the hardliners that we're harmless. We just have to show them that their orders are illegitimate. I felt something shift inside me. Not hope exactly. Clarity. Lin was right. The admirals had resigned because they had seen the truth. The steady group had held position because they too understood. Now the hardliners were the faction that either hadn't accepted the truth, didn't believe it, or had decided the mission should continue regardless. The battleground wasn't military. It was evidentiary. And the weapon was the lie itself, turned inside out and held up to the light. I brought Lin's proposal to Admiral Hale. She brought it to the task force. The vote was immediate and unanimous, the only unanimous vote in the task force's entire existence. We would reverse engineer the deception and broadcast it, and we had Elena's team to do it. What followed was the most intense analytical effort I have ever been part of. Elena's team, augmented by Lin's signal specialists, a cryptography group from the NSA, a linguistics team from the Max Planck Institute, and a mathematical logic group from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, worked for 72 hours straight to decode the fleet's disclosure transmission. They weren't just translating, they were reconstructing. The disclosure the admirals had sent us contained fragments of their original intelligence briefing, annotated with corrections, cross-referenced with our archive, and tagged with what appeared to be classification markers and chain of custody metadata. It was, in essence, a legal brief. The admirals had built a case against their own government, and they had shared the evidence with us. Our job was to take that evidence, understand its structure well enough to present it in the fleet's own communication format, and broadcast it on frequencies the hardliners couldn't ignore, not as a human plea, as an irrefutable reconstruction of the fraud that had sent them here. Elena slept 4 hours in 3 days. Lynn didn't sleep at all, as far as I could tell. I drifted in and out of a half-conscious state in a chair next to their workstation, reading updates as they came in, making decisions about priority and resource allocation, and trying very hard to ignore the real-time tracking display on the wall that showed the hardliner formation tightening its scanning pattern over Earth's northern hemisphere. On the second day of the effort, something happened that almost derailed everything. One of Elena's analysts, a young German mathematician named Tobias Richter, cracked a section of the disclosure that nobody had been able to parse. It contained a data structure that didn't match anything in the fleet's communication taxonomy. It was older, different formatting, different encryption. And when Tobias decoded it, he went white and called Elena over. And Elena went white and called me over, and I looked at what was on his screen and I understood why. It was the original scientific report, the real one, not the fabricated threat assessment that had been fed to the fleet. The actual findings of the alien civilization's scientific community when they first detected Earth's radio transmissions decades ago. The admirals had included it in their disclosure. They had found it buried in classified files, suppressed by whoever had commissioned the fabricated briefing, and they had passed it to us as part of their evidence package. And its conclusions were devastating. Not devastating for us, devastating for the lie. The original scientific report concluded that humanity was a convergent species, and not genetically related to the aliens, but developmentally parallel. Our cognitive patterns, social structures, technological progression, even the mathematical frameworks we use to describe the universe bore what the report called deep structural homology with the aliens' own civilization at a comparable stage of development. The scientists' recommendation, backed by extensive analysis and carrying the formal endorsement of their civilization's highest academic body, was immediate peaceful contact. They had described us not as a threat, not as a contagion, but as what they called a mirror civilization, a species whose existence confirmed a fundamental theory about how intelligent life develops in the universe. They said we were proof that consciousness follows patterns, that intelligence, wherever it arises, bioconverges on similar structures, that we were, in the deepest possible sense, the same kind of thing they were. The military establishment had buried this report. They had replaced it with a threat assessment that characterized every similarity as evidence of danger rather than kinship. Where the scientists saw convergence, the military saw competition. Where the scientists saw a mirror, the military saw a rival. And the reason, as the admiral's own investigation had uncovered, was as old as the concept of power itself. The military faction responsible for the fabrication was losing political influence at home. Their funding was being cut. Their authority was being questioned. They needed a threat to justify their existence. And a harmless species of convergent primates on a small blue planet 112 light-years away was not a threat. So they made us into one. When I finished reading, I sat down heavily and stared at the wall for a long time. Elena was already back at her workstation, integrating the original report into the broadcast package. Lynn was running signal format conversions. The machine was moving, but I needed a moment to sit with what I had just learned. Not the strategic implications, the emotional ones. Because what that report said, underneath all the scientific language and formal conclusions, was that a group of alien scientists had looked at us from across the galaxy and seen themselves. They had recognized something in our messy, contradictory, violent, beautiful signals that resonated with their own history. And they had wanted to meet us. And someone had taken that recognition and twisted it into a weapon. 71 hours after we started, the broadcast was ready. We had reconstructed the anatomy of the deception in the fleet's own communication format, complete with the suppressed scientific report, the fabricated threat assessment, the chain of custody evidence showing how one had been substituted for the other, and the Admiral's own annotations confirming the fraud. It was, in terms of pure information density, the most complex transmission humanity had ever produced. And it was going out on every frequency the fleet used, simultaneously, with enough power to be received by every ship in the formation. We broadcast it at 0600 UTC on day 19. The effect was immediate. Every faction in the fleet received it at the same time. The steady group, the leavers, and the hardliners all went silent simultaneously. Total cessation of intership communication. For 22 minutes, 1,100 ships hung motionless and mute around our planet while they processed what we had sent them, what their own admirals had uncovered, what their own scientists had concluded decades ago, what their own military leaders had hidden. When the signal traffic resumed, it resumed as a flood. Every ship was communicating with every other ship, not in factions but as a single network, the largest burst of coordinated signal activity the Elena had ever recorded. And within it, repeating in patterns that our linguists now had enough context to recognize, was a single phrase. The same phrase the admirals had used. Unworthy to command, it spread through the fleet like a fire. As ship after ship broadcast the phrase, each time in a slightly different context. Sometimes directed inward, sometimes directed outward, sometimes aimed at the empty space between them and a homeworld that wouldn't hear it for over a century. They were all saying it, not just the commanders, the crews, the navigators, the engineers. The entire fleet was collectively declaring the mission illegitimate, not because we had persuaded them, because their own evidence, their own scientists, their own suppressed truth had persuaded them. The hardliner formation broke apart at 1447 UTC. Their ships decelerated, ceased scanning, and began drifting into alignment with the steady group. The active targeting profiles vanished from our tracking displays. Elena, who had been monitoring the hardliner signals for days with attention that had aged her visibly, put her headphones down, put her face in her hands, and didn't move for several minutes. When she looked up, her eyes were red, and she said very quietly, "They stopped. They actually stopped." Day 20. The fleet transmitted to Earth for the final time. It was a long transmission, and decoding it fully would take months. But the opening segment, the part our linguists could translate quickly, contained three things. First, a formal apology. Not the kind of diplomatic language humans use when they're sorry they got caught. Something deeper. Something that our linguists said carried a cultural weight comparable to a civilization-wide act of atonement. They were sorry, not just for the siege, for the lie that had made it possible. For the suppression of their own scientists' findings, for the decades of silence when there should have been contact, for coming to us with weapons instead of words. Second, the original scientific report, unredacted and complete, transmitted in a format that was clearly designed for us to decode, a gift. The full findings of their scientists about humanity, about convergent evolution, about what they had seen in our signals that had made them believe we were kin. They were giving us the truth that should have been the first thing we ever received from them. And third, a departure notice. The fleet was leaving. All of it. Every ship, every faction, every remaining officer. They were returning to their homeworld, and they were carrying with them a record of everything that had happened here, the fabricated briefing. Off the Admiral's resignations, the suppressed report, our unedited archive, everything. They were going home to hold their own government accountable, and they were bringing the evidence. The fleet departed on day 21. The ships aligned into transit formation, a structure so elegant and so mathematically precise that Elena's team later published a paper on just its geometry. They accelerated out of Earth's orbital space in a coordinated burn that lit up our instruments for 3 hours, and then they were gone. The sky was empty again. The constellations came back. Orion returned. And the world, still shaking, still reeling, still not fully comprehending what had just happened, was left to deal with the aftermath. I want to tell you about the weeks after, because the story didn't end when the fleet left. In some ways, it started. Because the world fractured along lines that nobody had anticipated. The revelation that an alien civilization's military had fabricated a threat assessment to justify its own existence hit uncomfortably close to home for a lot of governments. Classified programs were leaked. Whistleblowers came forward. 3 defense ministers in 3 different countries resigned within a month, not because they were implicated in anything alien, but because the parallels were too sharp to ignore. If an alien civilization could lie its way into a war against a species it had never met, What exactly had our own military-industrial complexes been doing for the last century? The scientific community mobilized faster than I had ever seen. The original alien report, the convergent development findings, opened up entirely new fields of study. If intelligence really did converge on similar structures across the galaxy, then the implications for physics, biology, philosophy, and theology were staggering. Every university on Earth wanted a copy of the data. Every research institution wanted to be the first to replicate the aliens' findings using human methods. For the first time in my lifetime, the global scientific community was united around a single question, and the question wasn't about weapons or resources. It was about what kind of thing consciousness is, and whether the universe makes it the same way every time. But the thing I think about most, the thing that keeps me awake at night even now, years later, isn't the fleet or the admirals or the report. It's the timing. Elena's team eventually reconstructed the full timeline from the fleet's disclosure and the data embedded in the original scientific report. And here's what they found. The alien scientists detected our radio transmissions roughly 63 years before the fleet arrived. They spent 9 years analyzing them. They completed their report and submitted it to their government 54 years before the fleet arrived. The military suppressed it and commissioned the fabricated threat assessment 49 years before the fleet arrived. The fleet was authorized, constructed, crewed, and launched 31 years before it arrived. 31 years. That fleet traveled for 31 years to reach us. The beings inside those ships had spent 3 decades in transit, believing they were on a mission to contain a genuine threat. They had left their homes, their families, their world, and crossed 112 light years of void because someone had told them we were dangerous. And when they arrived and discovered the truth, they didn't attack us out of spite or sunk-cost logic. They stopped, they resigned, they apologized, they gave us the truth, and they went home. I keep circling back to that, 31 years of travel. And when they finally saw the evidence, they chose conscience over mission. They chose truth over momentum. 14 admirals looked at the lie that had defined their life's purpose and said, "I am unworthy to command," and meant it not as defeat but as honor, as the only honorable thing left to do. And then I think about the scientists. 63 years earlier, an alien researcher on a world I will never see looked at our radio transmissions and recognized something. Not a threat, not a resource, a reflection. Something familiar in the noise we made, something that said, "We know this shape. We know this pattern. This is how minds work everywhere, in every ocean of stars." And they wrote it down, and they were silenced, and they waited. For decades, they waited. And they never stopped believing they were right. I don't know their names. I don't know if they lived to see the fleet come home. I don't know if their vindication was celebrated or if it was too late, if they died discredited and alone, never knowing that the truth they fought for eventually reached us. But I know what they did. They looked at the universe and chose to see kinship instead of threat. They looked at us, at a species that hadn't even left its own solar system, a species that was still burning fossil fuels and fighting wars over lines on a map, and they said, "These are our people. They are early, they are messy, they are struggling, but they are ours. I'm not in the military anymore. I resigned 6 months after the fleet departed. Not because I was unworthy, but because I couldn't go back to watching empty space after what I had seen fill it. I work for the new International Contact Preparedness Commission now, the body that was established to coordinate humanity's response if and when we hear from them again. Because we will hear from them again. The fleet is traveling home with the truth, and when they arrive, in roughly 31 years, their civilization will know what happened, what was done in their name. And they will have to decide what to do about it. My job is to make sure that when that day comes, we're ready. Not with weapons, not with defenses, with an answer to the question they asked us on day 4. By what authority do you consume? I didn't understand it then. I think I understand it now. They weren't asking for a permit. They were asking if we understood the weight of what it means to exist, to take from a universe that doesn't owe you anything, to burn fuel and breathe air, and build cities on the skin of a world that was here long before you and will be here long after. They were asking if we knew that existence is not a right. It's a responsibility. I work on that answer every day. Some days, I think we're getting closer. Some days, I read the news and I'm not sure we've moved at all, but I keep working. Because I know something now that I didn't know before. I know we're not alone. I know that somewhere out there, 63 years ago, someone looked at the faint, messy, contradictory noise leaking from our little planet and saw something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, something worth crossing 112 light years of darkness to save from a lie. They saw us. They actually saw us. And what they saw, somehow, despite everything, was worth the truth. That's what I hold on to. Not the fleet, not the siege, not the fear. The fact that when the truth finally got through to the admirals, to the fleet, to every being in those 1,100 ships, it was enough. The truth about us, all of it, the worst of it, the best of it, everything we are and everything we've done. When it was laid bare, without excuses and without embellishment, it was enough. It was enough for them to stop. And on the days when I wonder if it was enough for us to change, I think about a fleet of 1,100 ships that traveled for 31 years on a lie and turned around because the truth was more powerful than the mission. If they can do it across the void of space, carrying the weight of decades and the betrayal of their own leaders, then maybe we can do it here. On this small blue world, with the constellations back in the sky where they belong. Maybe we can be what they saw in us. I don't know. But I know we have about 31 years to figure it out.